My parents favored my twin sister so much that they blew my wedding money on her, which I had been saving for a long time without telling me, so I tore. My parents favored my twin sister so much that they spent my wedding fund on her, so I cut ties with them after rejecting my mom's selfish demand. I'm a 23-year-old woman with a twin sister named Emily, who I no longer get along with. Scratch that. I don't even talk to her, or my parents. We used to at least have some kind of communication, despite how poorly they treated me in the past. But for the past 2 years, I've kept my distance, and they haven't bothered to reach out either, until recently. Emily is 12 minutes older than me, and by default, she's the golden child simply because she's the eldest. My parents only wanted one child, since that was their plan, and they didn't have the means to raise two. By the time they found out they were having twins, it was too late, and my mom didn't want to risk anything. I learned about this during high school from my drunk uncle at a Thanksgiving party, and that was pretty much the day I stopped trying to win my parents over. They did what anyone in their situation might do, gave birth to 2 kids, but decided to only love one. That favored child was Emily, not me. From when we were kids, the sibling rivalry between Emily and me was intense. Everything she did, I tried to do better, hoping to impress our parents. But the more I succeeded, the more they seemed to resent me for outshining their golden child. To be fair, Emily wasn't really interested in being better than me. She just craved validation. She pretended to care about our competition, manipulating people into believing she was hurt whenever I outdid her. This led to our parents, some relatives, and even a few people from high school sympathizing with her and putting me down to make her feel better. As a result of this competition, I ended up with good grades and a lot of extracurricular achievements, striving to be better than my sister. Meanwhile, Emily gained our parents' attention, validation, and sympathy, as I was painted as the villain for making her feel inferior. Looking back, I don't think I'd trade my accomplishments, but I sure would love to have rubbed it in her face more at the time. 2 years ago, we celebrated our 21st birthday. Both of us had graduated by then, she from a regular college, and I from one of the top business schools in the state. Not only that, but I was also the valedictorian and had a scholarship, which saved my parents a lot of money. Call me crazy, but I actually expected my parents to be proud of me. They weren't. Instead, they focused all their attention on Emily and her future, as she had barely managed to graduate. Both of us moved back home, but while I was working from home as an intern, Emily was struggling to find a job and getting rejected constantly. My parents cared more about her situation and didn't even bother to congratulate me. I couldn't say I was surprised, but I was definitely disappointed. I tried to hide my feelings because, at the time, I was still living with my parents and hadn't saved enough to move out. So I kept my mouth shut. But after our 21st birthday, I just couldn't anymore. I had expected them to do something special for our birthday, but the day before, I found out they'd left me home alone. They left a note saying they were heading to the beach with Emily and her friends and would be back in a few days. I remember feeling completely devastated when I read that note. My parents had taken Emily and her friends on a beach trip while all I got was a happy birthday note and a $50 gift card. Many things had been unfair during my childhood, but that was the final straw. It was so incredibly disappointing and heartless that I decided to move out that day and never look back. I had a couple of friends who were willing to let me stay with them until I could afford a place of my own, which wouldn't take long because the firm I was interning at was likely to hire me after my internship ended. So I just needed a place to live for about 2 months at most. I packed my things and moved in with a friend without informing my parents or sister. I haven't looked back since, and neither have they. They didn't miss me enough to ask me to come back. They did call me on my birthday the day after I moved out, but not to wish me well. They just wanted to tell me they would be back soon and suggested I get a plumber to fix the tap. I told them I wasn't living at home anymore and that I'd moved out, thinking at least that would get a reaction from them, but it didn't. My parents seemed fine with it, and Emily didn't care. That was the last proper conversation I had with my family. Since then, I haven't gone back to see them, nor have I heard from them. Occasionally, I'd hear about Emily from friends, which kept me somewhat updated on her life, but that was it. They knew nothing about my parents, and my parents knew nothing about me. Over the past 2 years, I've worked hard and now have a place of my own. It's not a mansion, but it's a nice apartment in a good neighborhood. The rent is affordable with my income, which is great because most people my age haven't managed to achieve this so quickly. I'm happy with how my life has turned out, and I've tried my best to keep my family out of my mind. I know Emily got married a few months ago to a businessman almost 10 years older than her, and she's now living it up in California. I thought everything was fine with my family, but 2 days ago, I received a call from my uncle telling me I needed to visit my parents quickly because they'd been in a terrible car accident and wanted to see me. I rushed to the hospital as soon as I could because, of course, I'm not that heartless. When I arrived, I found out they'd already been in the hospital for a few days and were recovering from their injuries. A truck had hit their car, and though they survived, they had serious injuries. They didn't have health insurance because my dad always believed that if we took care of ourselves, we wouldn't need a hospital. This is by far one of the most idiotic takes I've ever heard. They first contacted my sister, but she told them she wasn't going to come back or help them. Apparently, it was tacky for our parents to ask for financial help from their rich son-in-law so soon after the wedding. She didn't want to seem like a gold digger to her husband. She also didn't want to fly back because she couldn't just abandon her home and her 2 kids, who weren't even her own. They were her husband's kids from a previous marriage. She was too busy playing happy family with her husband's family to visit her own parents in the hospital after a terrible car accident. But even if she had wanted to help with the bills, she couldn't because of her husband. I remember feeling utterly crushed when I saw that note. My parents had whisked Emily and her friends away on a beach trip, while all I got was a simple happy birthday note and a $50 gift card. Many things about my childhood had been unfair, but this was the breaking point. It was so deeply disappointing and heartless that I decided right then and there to move out and never look back. Fortunately, a couple of friends offered to let me stay with them until I could find and afford a place of my own. This wouldn't take long, as the firm I was interning at was likely to hire me after my internship ended, so I just needed a temporary place for a couple of months. I packed my belongings and moved in with a friend without telling my parents or sister. Since then, I haven't looked back, and neither have they. They didn't miss me enough to ask me to come back. The day after I moved out, they called me, but not to wish me a happy birthday. They just wanted to tell me they'd be back soon and suggested I get a plumber to fix the tap. I informed them that I had moved out, hoping for some reaction, but there was none. My parents seemed fine with it, and Emily didn't care. That was the last substantial conversation I had with my family. Since then, I haven't visited them, and they haven't reached out to me. Occasionally, I'd hear updates about Emily from mutual friends, but that was it. They knew nothing about my parents, and my parents knew nothing about me. Over the past 2 years, I've worked hard and now have my own place. It's not a mansion, but it's a nice apartment in a good neighborhood. The rent is manageable with my income, which is a great achievement considering most people my age haven't reached this point so quickly. I'm satisfied with how my life has turned out and have done my best to keep my family out of my mind. I know Emily got married a few months ago to a businessman almost 10 years older than her and is now enjoying life in California. I assumed everything was fine with my family, but 2 days ago, I got a call from my uncle urging me to visit my parents urgently because they'd been in a severe car accident and wanted to see me. I rushed to the hospital as soon as I could because, despite everything, I'm not heartless. Upon arrival, I learned they'd been in the hospital for a few days, recovering from their injuries. A truck had hit their car, and while they survived, they sustained serious injuries. They didn't have health insurance because my dad always believed that if we took care of ourselves, we wouldn't need a hospital. This is, by far, one of the most ridiculous beliefs I've ever heard. They contacted my sister first, but she refused to help. She said it was inappropriate to ask her wealthy husband for financial help so soon after their wedding. She didn't want to appear like a gold digger. She also didn't want to leave her home and her stepchildren, her husband's kids from a previous marriage. She was too busy playing happy family to come see her own parents in the hospital after such a terrible accident. But even if she had wanted to help with the bills, she couldn't afford it without her husband's support. For the past week, my parents had been calling relentlessly. Yesterday, I finally realized I couldn't just ignore them indefinitely while they were in the hospital. So I answered their calls and told them that after some thought, I didn't feel compelled to help them. As expected, they didn't take it well. My mom, with her broken ribs, yelled at me as loudly as she could, calling me ungrateful and throwing the usual accusations my way. My dad simply told me I was no longer their daughter and hung up after my mom finished her tirade. Surprisingly, it didn't hurt as much as I thought it would. I hadn't felt like their daughter for a very long time. I can't even remember the last time I felt loved by my parents. They hadn't spoken to me or checked up on me for 2 years, just because I moved out after they ignored me on an important birthday. So, in reality, I never really had parents anyway. I'm just going to continue living my life the way I have been for the last 2 years, and probably even before that. This doesn't make a big difference to me, unlike what my parents thought it would. Unfortunately, my uncle called me after my conversation with my parents to give me another earful. I hung up after the first few seconds because I didn't need to hear this from anyone else. They could think whatever they wanted about me, it just didn't matter anymore. My uncle then texted me to inform me that my parents still had other family to turn to for money and that they had decided to use the funds set aside for our weddings. They had already spent more than half of it on Emily's wedding, and the little money left had been used for a Europe trip, leaving them with barely any savings. So that's one mystery solved. Of course, my uncle shared all this to make me feel guilty, but instead, I felt relieved that I hadn't spent my hard-earned money on my parents' bills. They had spent their own savings irresponsibly, and that wasn't my fault. Their lack of insurance due to their delusional beliefs was also not my fault. Now, they could borrow money from their relatives or deal with it themselves, but I wasn't giving them anything. They were no longer entitled to anything from me, not my time, and certainly not my money. Update 3. Hey, so something really weird happened today, and I need to get this off my chest. I haven't been able to talk to my friends about what's been happening, because most of the people I know right now haven't known me for long. I don't think I want to share my family history with them at this point, so Reddit is all I have. Anyway, it's been almost 2 weeks since I last spoke to my parents. A couple of hours ago, around the evening, Emily showed up at my place. I was surprised by her sudden visit, mainly because I didn't think she knew where I lived. But one of our old high school friends told her the neighborhood I lived in, and she did some asking around to find my exact location. It was a lot of effort for her to make just to see me. She also looked and acted very differently from what I remembered. She's become more refined and sophisticated, which is a huge change because she used to talk like she was still in high school. Now, she sounds more ladylike and behaves better. Her way of dressing has changed, her jewelry is different, and even her makeup looks more polished. It felt like I wasn't even talking to Emily anymore. Everything about her seemed aged suddenly, but one thing that hasn't changed is her personality. I guess you can't put makeup on your heart and tell people to call it Mrs. Johnson, like she did with herself. Her personality and beliefs haven't undergone any renovation, for sure. After she knocked on my door, I let her in. I was really surprised to see her, but also curious to know why she had come by. After some small talk about her life, where she unprompted told me everything she'd been up to and bragged about how fabulous her life was as a stay-at-home mom of 2 toddlers married to a wealthy man, I waited for her to get to the point. She talked about how wonderful and underrated being a traditional housewife was, and even advised me to consider the same lifestyle. I politely nodded through her boring speech, eager for her to finally address the real reason for her visit. After about 15 minutes of talking about herself, she finally got to the point. Emily said she had come back on her own because our parents had been begging her to visit after the accident. They didn't want her money, they just wanted her to be there for them. So after 2 weeks, she finally came back and decided to see me too, hoping we could bury the hatchet. So far, so good. But then she started complaining about how needy our parents were, and how they were disrespecting her new family. She ranted about having to leave her 2 babies with their nanny just to visit our parents, and expressed her hatred for making her choose between them and her kids. I couldn't understand why she kept referring to them as her kids, when they obviously weren't hers. She told me a lot about her marriage and husband, even though I hadn't asked. From what I gathered, the guy she'd married probably only did so to increase his chances of getting at least partial custody of his kids, which he did. She thought he actually loved her or something. He had been in a custody battle for quite some time, and since he was a full-time businessman, he didn't have enough time for his kids. His ex-wife used that against him, but then he announced his engagement and marriage as soon as the divorce came through, which tilted the scales in his favor. Emily bragged about how she had saved those kids, but to me, it sounded like her husband had used her. They hadn't even known each other for more than a year when he proposed, so it was clear he wasn't in love with her. Nobody falls in love that quickly, especially after a divorce. She seemed blissfully unaware of this, or maybe knew but chose to overlook it for the sake of his bank balance. She appeared content being a glorified nanny to his kids. She was also mad at our parents for wanting her by their side after their severe accident, because it took time away from her new family, a family that included a husband who probably didn't love her, and 2 kids who were doing just as fine with their nanny as with her. If ungrateful ever had a face, it would be Emily's. I'm no fan of my parents myself, but honestly, listening to her complain about how needy they were, I couldn't believe this was the girl they had repeatedly chosen over me. Finally, she got to the main point of her visit and told me she'd be leaving in 2 days. She had promised Mom and Dad that she'd stay for at least a month, but she claimed she was already bored of listening to them talk about the accident and how it was the worst experience of their lives, for the 10th time, and needed to get back home soon. So now, she wanted me to reconcile with them and take her place, because she didn't want to feel the guilt of abandoning our parents when they needed her. She didn't know that they had cut me off yet again because I refused to help with the bills, probably because they don't think of or talk about me. They hadn't mentioned any of this to Emily. She was seeking sympathy from me for having to deal with our parents and abandon her new family, and now wanted to use that sympathy to make me step into her role as our parents' emotional support because she didn't want the responsibility. It was classic Emily manipulation, but I knew it all too well and didn't fall for it. I had no intention of telling her the truth while she was at my house, as it would inevitably lead to a fight, so I told her I'd try, knowing full well that I wouldn't. She left after telling me to keep in touch, but we both knew she didn't mean it. I was relieved to see her go because not only was she narcissistic and terrible, but she was also incredibly boring to talk to. I could barely get a word in while she droned on about her uninteresting life in California. Her life basically revolves around parties, her stepchildren, and her husband. She thinks she's living the dream, but I found it really sad. Her husband clearly doesn't love her, and her stepkids spend half their time with their biological mom. They're bound to prefer their mom over Emily, if they don't already. But that's her choice, and I choose a life far away from my family because they don't deserve even a fraction of my attention or sympathy. Today's visit reaffirmed that I've been right to distance myself from my parents and sister. I don't want to be part of their lives. They're incredibly selfish and cruel, incapable of thinking of anyone but themselves, especially Emily. I'm ashamed to be related to such people. At least now, I've been able to cut ties with all of them for good, and it's unlikely they'll reach out to me anytime soon. I blocked Emily as soon as she left, and had already blocked my parents and other relatives for days now, so I think I'm safe from being troubled by my family for the foreseeable future. I'll pray they don't get back in touch with me after this because I'm much better off without them.